Moscow, September 1989. Nina Petrovna had been standing in line since 4:47 a.m. She knew the exact time because she'd checked her watch when the woman behind her asked if this queue was really for soap. Actual soap, not the grainy brown blocks that stripped your skin raw. Now, 6 hours later, the sun had climbed above the concrete apartment blocks of her microrayon, and Nina could finally see the store entrance. Her feet throbbed, her back ached. She clutched a crumpled shopping bag, her avoska, the maybe bag, named because maybe you'll find something to put in it. The irony wasn't lost on her. The Soviet Union had just launched Phobos 2 to Mars. Soviet physicists had helped unlock the atom. The Red Army had defeated Hitler and planted their flag in Berlin. Yet here she stood, a 34-year-old electrical engineer, spending her Saturday waiting to buy soap because the world's second superpower couldn't manufacture enough of it. Behind her, the line stretched around the block, 200 women, maybe 300, all clutching their own maybe bags. Nobody complained out loud. That wasn't done. But Nina saw the exhaustion in their faces, the quiet fury in their eyes. This wasn't a crisis. Not really. It was Tuesday. This was just how things were. She didn't know it yet, but she was standing in the queue that would help end the Cold War. Not this specific line, of course, but all the lines like it, stretching across 11 time zones, filled with women who'd stopped believing the promise of socialist abundance. Within 2 years, the hammer and sickle would be lowered from the Kremlin for the last time. And historians, obsessed with missiles and summits and Gorbachev's reforms, would largely miss what Nina understood in her bones. You can't sustain an empire when you can't supply tampons. The Soviet consumer goods crisis wasn't supposed to happen. According to the logic that had governed communist planning since Lenin, it was actually impossible. The capitalist system cannot regulate consumption scientifically, declared Nikolai Voznesensky, Stalin's chief economic planner, in 1947. Only socialist planning can match production to the real needs of the people. The mathematics seemed sound. No wasteful advertising creating artificial demand. No profit-seeking manufacturers producing luxury goods instead of necessities. Just rational calculation. Count the population. Determine their needs. Produce accordingly. Soap, toilet paper, sanitary products, toothpaste. These were simple commodities. Their production straightforward chemistry and manufacturing. American observers initially agreed that Soviet planning had advantages in basic goods production. The command economy eliminates the chaos of the market, noted economist Paul Samuelson in his 1961 textbook, widely used in American universities. Soviet citizens may lack consumer choice, but they won't lack necessities. The CIA's assessments through the 1960s painted a picture of a society where everyone had enough, if not abundance. Nobody would be rich, but nobody would go without soap. Soviet propaganda reinforced this narrative relentlessly. Posters showed smiling workers in gleaming factories, store shelves overflowing with goods. The Soviet people live better year by year, proclaimed billboards across the USSR. When Nixon and Khrushchev had their famous kitchen debate in 1959, arguing over which system provided better living standards, Khrushchev confidently predicted that Soviet citizens would surpass American consumption within a generation. He genuinely believed it. In the Kremlin's planning offices on Staraya Square, technocrats worked with scientific certainty. They had input-output tables, production quotas, 5-year plans calculated down to the last bar of soap. Gosplan, the state planning committee, employed thousands of economists who could tell you exactly how many tampons every Soviet woman would need in 1975. The system was rational. The system was scientific. The system would work. Even during the 1970s, as the first serious shortages began appearing, Soviet economists explained them away as temporary bottlenecks or sabotage by hostile elements. CIA analyst David Wilson, reviewing Soviet consumer statistics in 1976, noted puzzling inconsistencies but concluded that the USSR maintains adequate if austere provision of basic necessities to its population. Western economists, still impressed by Soviet space achievements and military production, assumed the Kremlin could fix consumer goods production whenever it chose to prioritize it. We'll overtake capitalism in consumer goods, just as we overtook them in steel production. Leonid Brezhnev assured a Communist Party Congress in 1976. It's merely a question of properly directing our resources. He said this while his own wife, Victoria, was using her position to smuggle Western cosmetics and toiletries into the USSR, unable to find acceptable Soviet alternatives, even with her privileges. The women standing in lines knew better. They'd been watching the shelves empty for years. But their knowledge didn't count. They were consumers, not planners. The planners had the data. The planners had the science. The planners were about to discover that you can't plan away reality. The seeds of the Soviet soap crisis were planted in the 1920s, with the very structure of Stalin's command economy. When the Bolsheviks industrialized the USSR, they made a fateful choice: prioritize heavy industry over consumer goods. Steel, coal, machine tools, weapons. These received investment and top-quality management. Consumer goods got the scraps. We are 50 to 100 years behind the advanced countries, Stalin declared in 1931. We must make good this distance in 10 years. Either we do it, or we shall be crushed. He built the steel mills. He built the tank factories. He built an industrial base that would eventually defeat Hitler. Consumer goods could wait. The waiting never ended. Even after World War II, when the immediate crisis had passed, Soviet planning continued to favor heavy industry. Ministry of Heavy Industry officials were powerful party members, often with military backgrounds, who commanded respect. Ministry of Light Industry officials were afterthoughts. Their production targets routinely sacrificed when resource conflicts arose. The organizational structure guaranteed failure. A soap factory in Leningrad didn't produce soap for Leningrad citizens. It produced soap for the Ministry of Light Industry in Moscow, which allocated it according to planned targets to various regional distribution networks, which delivered it to state stores, which sold it at state-fixed prices regardless of actual local demand. If Leningrad needed more soap than allocated, too bad. If rural Siberia received more soap than needed, the excess sat in warehouses, deteriorating. Marina Ivanovna, who managed a hygiene products factory in Kiev from 1967 to 1985, later recalled the absurdity. We had production quotas measured in tons of soap produced, not bars of soap people wanted to buy, tons manufactured. So we made the biggest, heaviest bars possible to meet our quota with less work. Whether anyone wanted enormous soap bars was irrelevant. We met plan. The quality deterioration was systematic. Soap factories received quotas for quantity, never quality specifications. They received raw materials of whatever quality the chemical plants provided, and chemical plants faced the same perverse incentives. Tallow supplies came from meat processing plants focused on their own quotas. Cotton oil came from agricultural processing prioritizing crude volume. Nobody in the chain had any incentive to produce quality, because quality wasn't measured and couldn't be rewarded. By the 1970s, Soviet soap was legendary for its awfulness. Gray-brown blocks that barely lathered, leaving skin dry and irritated. Toothpaste that tasted like chalk and rarely came in tubes, usually cardboard boxes. Shampoo that was essentially diluted laundry detergent. Toilet paper like sandpaper, when it existed at all. Tampon production revealed the system's particularly perverse failures. The Krasnodar Sanitary Products Factory, one of only 3 tampon manufacturers in the entire USSR, received its production quota in 1975. 50 million tampons annually for a country of 254 million people, roughly half of them women. A Soviet woman averaged perhaps 450 periods in her lifetime. Simple math suggested she'd have access to roughly 150 tampons, total, for her entire life. But even this catastrophically insufficient production often didn't reach stores. Valentina Dmitrieva, who worked in Moscow's retail distribution network, explained, tampons were classified as luxury goods for allocation purposes. They went first to special stores for party officials and foreign diplomats, then to major cities. Rural areas got almost nothing. Women in villages used rags like their grandmothers had. The economic logic was insane but internally consistent. Tampons required cotton processing, packaging materials, and distribution networks that could have produced something else. Sanitary pads required even more materials. The plan allocated these resources to enterprises with higher political priority. Year after year, 5-year plan after 5-year plan, feminine hygiene products remained a residual category, produced only after everything more important had been manufactured. Soap fell into a similar trap. The chemical industry could make soap or industrial detergents for factories. Factory managers had direct lines to ministry officials. Housewives didn't. Industrial detergents won. The light industry could package soap properly or save packaging materials for more important products. It saved the materials. Proper packaging wasn't in the plan. By 1980, the USSR was producing less soap per capita than it had in 1913 under the Tsar. This wasn't for lack of industrial capacity. Soviet chemical plants were enormous modern facilities. It was because the entire system had been designed for a different purpose. Military industrial production, heavy industry, prestige projects. Consumer goods were an afterthought, always deprioritized, never quite important enough to fix. The Soviet leadership knew about the problem. KGB reports from the 1970s regularly flagged consumer dissatisfaction as a political risk. But fixing it would require restructuring the entire economy's incentive systems, impossible without admitting the fundamental failures of central planning. So they temporized, launched occasional campaigns to improve consumer goods, shuffled ministry officials, and hoped the problem would resolve itself. It wouldn't. It couldn't. The system was working exactly as designed, and the design was broken. Leningrad, January 15, 1981. Dawn. The temperature was -18 Celsius when the first women arrived at store number 47 on Moskovsky Prospect. They'd heard a rumor, reliable from a clerk's sister-in-law, that a shipment of Polish soap would arrive Thursday morning. Real soap, the kind that actually cleaned your skin without stripping it raw. By 6 a.m., 200 women stood in the frozen darkness, breath-forming clouds in the streetlight glow. Ludmila Sergeyevna, a 42-year-old schoolteacher, had left home at 5:15 a.m. My husband thought I was crazy, she recalled years later. 6 hours standing in the cold for soap. But he didn't understand. You can't teach children when your hair is unwashed, when you smell from yesterday's sweat because you have nothing to properly clean yourself with. Dignity requires soap. When the store opened at 9 a.m., the line surged. The shipment was smaller than rumored, only 300 bars for a neighborhood of 50,000. The store manager, terrified of riots, imposed a strict limit. 1 bar per person, no exceptions. Women who'd stood for 4 hours went home empty-handed. Those who succeeded clutched their purchases like precious metals, wrapped carefully in their Avaska bags. 3 blocks away, simultaneously, Another line formed at pharmacy number 128. Word had spread about tampons, actual manufactured tampons, not the medical cotton women usually improvised with. Anya Koroleva, then 28 and working at the Kirov factory, joined the queue at 7:30 a.m. after her night shift. I was exhausted, hadn't slept, but I couldn't pass this up. I had maybe 5 tampons left at home. Who knew when they'd appear again? By noon, the pharmacy line had grown to 400 women. The pharmacist, increasingly nervous, kept stepping outside to count heads and estimate how long the supply would last. Women were calculating out loud, she remembered. Not how many should I buy for myself, but how can I get enough for my daughter, my sister, my mother? The arithmetic of scarcity. The shipment contained 2,000 tampons. The pharmacist imposed a strict allocation, 10 per customer. At that rate, a woman could manage about 2 periods, then back to making improvised pads from cotton wool and gauze, or worse, using rags that needed washing and drying in secret, because discussing menstruation was still taboo in Soviet society. Moscow, 982. The pattern was repeating in every Soviet city, but Moscow was different. In the capital, shortages became political theater. Foreign correspondents photographed the queues. Western radio stations broadcast reports. Dissidents whispered that a system requiring educated women to spend 6 hours hunting for soap had forfeited its claim to superiority over capitalism. Irina Ratushinskaya, the poet who would later be imprisoned for her dissident writings, captured the absurdity in a piece she circulated in Samizdat. We have conquered space, but not the bathroom. We have split the atom, but not manufactured sufficient soap to split the dirt from Soviet skin. We are a superpower in everything, except the things that make life bearable. KGB surveillance reports from early 1982 documented the political damage. One report, declassified after the Soviet collapse, noted, "Growing complaints among intelligentsia regarding consumer goods situation. Particular resentment among professional women forced to spend work time queuing for necessities. Unfavorable comparisons with Western living standards increasingly common. Recommend immediate action to address soap and feminine hygiene supply deficits." The recommendations went nowhere. Yuri Andropov, then KGB chairman and soon-to-be Soviet leader, understood the problem intellectually. But fixing it would require reducing military production, scaling back heavy industry investments, decentralizing economic decision-making, changes that threatened every power structure in the Soviet system. Volgograd, June 1984. The crisis was particularly acute in provincial cities. Svetlana Alexievich, the Nobel Prize-winning journalist, later interviewed dozens of women about their experiences. One Volgograd factory worker told her, "We had a saying, Moscow has shortages. We have none, because none means there's nothing to be short of. A Moscow woman might queue 6 hours and get soap. We queued 6 hours, and the store never received any shipment at all." In provincial cities, women developed elaborate networks for obtaining basic goods. They called their connections blat, informal relationships that could get you access to scarce items. I knew a woman who worked in a soap warehouse, recalled Natasha Petrova, a Volgograd nurse. I'd give her fresh bread from my sister who worked at a bakery. She'd give me soap, not because anyone was corrupt, just because this was the only way to survive. The official economy had failed, so we built an unofficial one. The feminine hygiene situation in provincial areas approached catastrophic. Rural women had essentially no access to manufactured sanitary products. They used rags, newspaper, even just layered underwear when nothing else was available. Infections were common. Absenteeism from work and school during periods was routine. Another economic drag the planners never factored into their calculations. Leningrad, August 1987. By the late 1980s, the The shortage situation had progressed from serious to absurd. Irina Grekova, a mathematics professor and novelist, wrote in her diary on August 12, 1987, "Today I spent 9 hours hunting for basic supplies. 2 hours for bread, they'd run out at the first store. 3 hours for soap, got 1 small bar. 4 hours for tampons, none available anywhere. I have a doctorate in mathematics. I teach at the university. And I spend my life standing in lines like a medieval peasant hoping for grain. This cannot continue." It couldn't, but it did. Gorbachev's glasnost allowed people to speak openly about the shortages for the first time. Newspaper articles appeared with titles like "Why No Soap?" and "The Tampon Question." The discussions were explosive because they struck at the core legitimacy of the Soviet system. If communism couldn't provide soap, what could it provide? Foreign journalists seized on the stories. An NBC News report in January 1988 showed Soviet women queuing for hours in Moscow's freezing cold. "These are engineers, doctors, teachers," correspondent Bob Abernethy narrated. "Educated professionals in a superpower nation, spending half their Saturday fighting for soap." The image of queue-bound Soviet women became an international symbol of communist failure. Moscow, October 1989. The true turning point came in October 1989, when the Congress of People's Deputies, Gorbachev's attempt at democratic reform, held its first open session. Deputy Galina Starovoytova, representing Leningrad, made an impassioned speech that electrified the nation. "Comrade deputies, we discuss arms control and economic reform, but we ignore what every Soviet woman knows. This system has failed in its most basic obligation. I am an ethnographer with a doctorate. Last week I spent 7 hours queuing to buy soap and tampons for my daughter. 7 hours of my life, which could have been spent on research, on teaching, on anything productive, wasted because our economy cannot manufacture and distribute basic hygiene products. We have 30,000 nuclear warheads but insufficient soap. We launch satellites but cannot supply sanitary products. This is not a temporary shortage. This is systematic failure, and every woman in this country knows it, even if the men in charge have pretended otherwise for decades." The speech was broadcast on Soviet television. Millions of women watched someone finally say, in official Soviet political discourse, what they'd been thinking for years. The applause in the Congress Hall lasted for 3 full minutes. In apartments across the USSR, women wept and cheered. The speech changed little practically. Stores didn't suddenly fill with soap. But it changed everything psychologically. The emperor had no clothes, and now everyone could admit it. The system that claimed to serve the people couldn't even provide them with soap. What then was it for? Western recognition. Western intelligence agencies had been tracking Soviet consumer shortages for years, but they'd consistently underestimated their political significance. A CIA report from 1983 noted consumer goods problems, but concluded, while annoying to the population, these shortages do not threaten regime stability. Soviet citizens have adapted to scarcity and have low expectations compared to Western standards. They'd completely missed the point. The shortages did threaten stability, not through revolution, but through a slow erosion of belief. Every woman standing in line for soap was conducting a cost-benefit analysis of the Soviet system, and the system was failing the test. By 1988, however, Western analysis had shifted. A State Department briefing paper noted, "The consumer goods crisis has become a political crisis. Soviet women, particularly educated urban women, increasingly express contempt for a system that cannot provide basic necessities. This represents a fundamental legitimacy challenge to communist rule." American policymakers began to see opportunity. Reagan's speechwriters incorporated consumer shortage references into presidential addresses. In America, a woman can walk into any store and buy soap, Reagan noted in a 1988 speech. In the Soviet Union, she must wait in line for hours and often goes home empty-handed. This is not the result of different values. It is the result of different systems, one that works and one that doesn't. Soviet response: too little, too late. The Soviet leadership scrambled to respond, but every solution ran into the same structural problems. In 1985, Gorbachev launched the Program for Intensification of Consumer Goods Production, essentially ordering light industry to increase output. But you can't order results in an economy with perverse incentives. Soap factories, told to increase production, made even larger, lower-quality bars to hit their tonnage quotas. Tampon factories, given more resources, improved packaging but couldn't significantly increase output because cotton supplies were controlled by the Ministry of Agriculture, which prioritized industrial cotton exports. Every fix in one area created bottlenecks elsewhere. Some factory managers tried genuine innovation. The Kazan soap factory, led by a reform-minded director named Viktor Yakovlev, attempted to implement quality controls in 1986. Workers would reject substandard raw materials and refuse to produce inferior soap. "We'll make less soap, but better soap," Yakovlev told his staff. "People will buy better soap. Stores will order more, and eventually will expand." The ministry shut him down within 3 months. His factory's tonnage output had fallen. Under plan rules, that meant failure, regardless of quality or actual consumer satisfaction. Yakovlev was transferred to a cement plant. The Kazan factory went back to producing heavy, awful soap that met quotas and satisfied no one. Other managers took a different approach: black market cooperation. In Minsk, a soap factory director named Andrei Sokolov made an unofficial deal with a cooperative, the small private businesses Gorbachev had legalized. The cooperative would buy raw materials privately. The factory would manufacture soap off the books, and the cooperative would sell it for profit. "Everyone won," Sokolov explained years later. "We got bonuses, the cooperative made money, and citizens got decent soap. The only loser was the plan, which was already fiction anyway." These underground adaptations became increasingly common by the late 1980s. Official statistics showed soap production remaining steady, but reality was different. More and more production was happening outside official channels, with factory managers using state resources for private manufacturing. The command economy was being hollowed out from within. Feminine hygiene, capitalist solutions. The tampon situation evolved differently, because tampons were easier to smuggle and import. By 1987, Polish and Hungarian manufacturers had begun producing tampons for hard currency export to the USSR. These products, though expensive, were vastly superior to Soviet alternatives. A black market developed immediately. In Moscow, foreign currency stores, Beryozkas, that had previously catered only to diplomats and foreign tourists began selling Western tampons to Soviets with hard currency. A box of 20 Tampax tampons cost about $5, roughly 20% of an average monthly salary at the black market exchange rate. Women bought them anyway, when they could. "I remember my first American tampon," recalled Katerina Tikhonova, a Moscow translator who had access to hard currency. "It was revelation. It actually worked. It didn't leak, didn't irritate, didn't fall apart. I understood then what we'd been missing. Not just a product, but an entire philosophy of consumer service that prioritized what users actually needed." The economic reforms of perestroika accelerated these trends. By 1989, cooperatives could legally import consumer goods. Polish and East German soap flooded into major cities, priced higher than Soviet soap, but actually available. The cues began to shift. Instead of queuing for scarce Soviet goods, women queued to buy imported alternatives that actually worked. Domestic consequences. The consumer goods crisis fundamentally altered Soviet domestic politics. Women, who'd been relatively absent from political discourse, became increasingly vocal. Feminist groups formed, nominally discussing women's rights, but really protesting the economic system's failure to serve their basic needs. Anastasia Posadskaya, who founded the Moscow Center for Gender Studies in 1989, described the political awakening. Western feminists talked about equality in the boardroom. Soviet feminists talked about equality and not having to waste our lives standing in lines. We had full employment, access to education, representation in government. And none of it mattered because we couldn't buy soap. The consumer goods crisis became a feminist issue because it showed how little the male-dominated leadership valued women's time and dignity. The political impact cascaded through Soviet society. Professional women, particularly those in academia and technical fields, became increasingly radicalized. They'd been among the system's strongest supporters, educated beneficiaries of socialist meritocracy. Now they were among its harshest critics, because they felt the contradiction most keenly. They had PhDs and couldn't buy tampons. Family dynamics shifted too. Soviet ideology had promoted women's equality through full workforce participation. By the late 1980s, women were questioning whether that was really equality. My mother's generation believed Soviet propaganda about women's liberation, said Olga Lipovskaya, a Leningrad activist. My generation realized we'd just been given 2 full-time jobs, career and domestic labor, while men had one. And the domestic labor had become enormously harder because of shortages. Young women particularly rejected Soviet claims about progress. Surveys in Leningrad in 1989 showed that 67% of women under 30 believed Soviet living standards were inferior to Western ones, compared to just 34% of women over 50. The older generation remembered wartime deprivation and felt grateful for stability. The younger generation had no such memories and felt only resentment about standing in lines. International implications. The soap crisis became an unexpected front in Cold War ideological competition. American and European leaders, who'd spent decades arguing about nuclear weapons and spheres of influence, discovered that consumer goods made a more compelling argument for capitalism's superiority than any military comparison. Margaret Thatcher's 1987 visit to Moscow included carefully staged encounters with Soviet women. In one famous exchange, a Leningrad schoolteacher asked Thatcher about life in Britain. "Do you have to queue for bread?" she asked. "Never," Thatcher replied. "And soap? There are dozens of brands in every store." The teacher's face, captured by British television cameras, showed a mix of disbelief and despair that resonated worldwide. Eastern European dissidents seized on the consumer crisis as evidence that communist reform was impossible. Václav Havel, then a Czech dissident playwright, wrote, "Moscow cannot provide soap to its own citizens, yet claims to lead a workers' paradise. Prague cannot manufacture decent shoes, yet claims to represent the future. The gap between ideological claims and lived reality has become too vast to bridge with propaganda." The consumer crisis also affected Soviet allies. Cuba, North Korea, and Vietnam faced similar shortages, but had blamed them on American sanctions or war damage. Now their populations saw that even the mighty USSR, untouched by war and free from sanctions, couldn't provide basic goods. The systemic nature of communist economic failure became undeniable. Moscow, December 1990. The peak came not with dramatic shortage, but with something more surreal: abundance without supply. In late 1990, Soviet stores began receiving Western consumer goods through new import agreements. Procter & Gamble soap, Tampax tampons, Johnson & Johnson shampoo, all suddenly appearing on shelves that had been empty for years. The catch: prices. A bar of decent soap now cost 15 rubles, more than a day's wages for most workers. Western tampons cost 45 rubles per box. The products were there, visible, accessible, and completely unaffordable for ordinary Soviet citizens. Galina Volchek, the artistic director of Moscow's Sovremennik Theater, captured the bitter irony. For decades we queued because there was nothing to buy. Now there's something to buy, but no money to buy it with. We've traded Soviet scarcity for capitalist inequality, and I'm not sure which is worse. At least before, we were all equally miserable. Now we watch wealthy people buy what we can't afford. The visible presence of goods that couldn't be purchased may have been psychologically worse than simple shortage. It made poverty concrete and unavoidable. Middle-class Soviet citizens, who'd considered themselves relatively well off under the old system, suddenly felt poor. Not because their situation had worsened, but because they could now see what they couldn't have. This was the final crisis of communist legitimacy. The system had promised equality and delivered universal scarcity. Now it was transitioning to a system that promised prosperity and was delivering visible inequality. Neither version worked. Neither delivered what Soviet citizens desperately wanted: a normal life where you could buy soap when you needed it, without drama. The human cost statistics barely capture the cumulative human cost of the consumer goods crisis. Consider this. If an average Soviet woman spent 6 hours per week hunting for basic supplies, a conservative estimate for urban women in the 1980s, that's 3 to 12 hours per year, the equivalent of nearly 8 work weeks, spent on procurement rather than family, career, education, or leisure. Multiply that across 70 million adult Soviet women over a decade, and you're looking at roughly 218 billion hours of wasted human potential. That's more time than it took to build the Soviet nuclear program, more than it took to win World War II, more than it took to launch the space program. All of it frittered away, standing in lines because the command economy couldn't match supply to demand. The psychological toll was equally devastating. Psychologists who later studied Soviet women described symptoms resembling chronic stress disorders, anxiety about resource availability, hoarding behaviors, difficulty trusting institutional systems, persistent feelings of humiliation. The cues damaged us, one woman told researchers. Not just the wasted time, but the constant reminder that we didn't matter, that our needs weren't important enough to address. The collapse. When the Soviet Union finally collapsed in December 1991, Western analysts focused on geopolitics: Reagan's military buildup, Gorbachev's reforms, nationalist movements in the republics. They largely missed what Soviet women understood. The system had already failed years earlier, when it stopped providing for basic human needs. Yegor Gaidar, Russia's first post-Soviet economic minister, recognized this in his memoirs. The soap crisis wasn't a trivial problem. It was a symptom of comprehensive system failure. An economy that couldn't manufacture soap couldn't be fixed by tinkering with quotas or replacing managers. It needed to be rebuilt from scratch, with different fundamental principles. Once people understood that, the USSR's days were numbered. The first act of post-Soviet economic reform was telling: price liberalization in January 1992. Overnight, store shelves filled with goods as producers responded to real market prices rather than planned quotas. The abundance was extraordinary and extraordinarily expensive. But at least products existed. The chronic shortages ended not because production increased, but because the economic system changed. Nina Petrovna, the woman from our opening, survived the Soviet collapse and thrived in the new Russia. She became a successful small business owner, running a chain of beauty supply stores across Moscow. In a 2010 interview, she reflected on those queue-bound years. People ask me if I'm nostalgic for Soviet times. I tell them, I'm nostalgic for my youth, for when my parents were alive, for when I believed the world would get better. I'm not nostalgic for standing 6 hours to buy soap. That wasn't life. That was waste. The Soviet Union didn't fail because of Ronald Reagan, or because of dissidents, or because communism is theoretically impossible. It failed because it couldn't provide soap to women who wanted to stay clean. Everything else, the ideology, the military power, the superpower status, was built on that failure. And eventually, the structure collapsed. The soap crisis reveals a fundamental truth about the Cold War that conventional histories often miss. Legitimacy doesn't come from nuclear weapons or space programs or ideological purity. It comes from meeting citizens' basic needs. The Soviet Union could split atoms, but not manufacture sufficient toilet paper. It could launch satellites, but not supply tampons. This wasn't a trivial contradiction. It was an existential one. Western triumphalism about the Cold War's outcome often misses this lesson. The USSR didn't lose because capitalism is inevitably superior. It lost because Soviet leaders chose to prioritize military production and heavy industry over consumer welfare, then locked themselves into institutional structures that made changing course impossible. A different communist system, one that actually prioritized consumer needs, might have survived. But that wasn't the system the Soviets built. The legacy extends into post-Soviet Russia. The trauma of scarcity still shapes consumer behavior. Older Russians hoard supplies, distrust institutions, and maintain elaborate social networks for obtaining goods. The memory of those cues influences Russian politics. Leaders who can promise stability and adequate supplies win loyalty, even at the cost of freedom. Perhaps most importantly, the soap crisis demonstrated that you can't fool people about their own lived experience. Soviet propaganda could claim the system worked, but women standing in 6-hour queues knew better. That gap between official narrative and reality, maintained for decades, ultimately destroyed belief in the entire Soviet project. You can sustain an empire through force, but not through force alone. Eventually, the soap runs out, and the people go home. Nina Petrovna still keeps extra soap in her apartment 20 years after scarcity ended. Just in case, she says, though she can't really explain what she's preparing for. The lines are gone, but their memory remains. That's the real legacy of the Soviet consumer goods crisis. Not just a system that failed, but a generation that learned not to trust systems at all. The Cold War ended with summits and treaties, with flags lowered and borders opened. But it ended first in the queues, where women voted with their feet against a system that had promised everything and couldn't deliver soap.